Let's learn about an even newer feature of objects and also of arrays, which is called optional chaining. And this one is really amazing. So let's say that we wanted to get the opening hours of our restaurant for Monday. So let's quickly check that. So restaurant.opening hours. And then, since we are checking for Monday, let's try .mon, so which could stand for Monday. Now actually this property doesn't exist. So you see that this is undefined, right? But let's pretend that we do not know whether this restaurant opens on Monday or not. And that could be the case, for example, if this data came from a real web service, so a web API. And in that service, there could be multiple restaurants and not all of them would open on Monday. And so we had no way of knowing if this particular restaurant would open on Monday or not. But now let's go even further, because we actually want to know exactly the hour on which the restaurant opens on Monday. So let's see what we get. And now we do actually get an error, because the result of this was undefined, and then undefined.open is really an error. So that's the error that we get here. So in order to avoid this error, we would first have to check if this here actually exists. So we could do something like this. If this property exists, basically, then do this. Or we could also use a logical operator, as we already learned, but this here is a bit more readable. All right. So if we did the same for, let's say, Friday, then we already know that Friday exists, and so this would then work, and it would be 11. But let's focus here on Monday, which is the day that doesn't exist. And so now at least we get rid of our error here. So it's not a big deal to having to add this logic here, but it does make our code a little bit more unreadable and more messy. However, this is checking just for one property, so just for Monday. But now imagine that opening hours here would also be optional. Or in other words, that maybe the restaurant object can also not have opening hours. So in this case, we would have to check for both, right? So we would have to do if restaurant.opening hours exists, and if restaurant.opening hours.monday exists, well, only then log the opening hours to the console. And this can get out of hand pretty quickly when we have deeply nested objects with lots of optional properties. And sometimes that happens in the real world. And so therefore, ES 2020 introduced a great solution for this, which is a feature called optional chaining. And with optional chaining, if a certain property does not exist, then undefined is returned immediately. And so that will then avoid that kind of error that we saw earlier. And this is how it works. So let's recreate it now with optional chaining. So now we can say restaurant.opening hours.monday, and now here is the optional chaining operator. So instead of just a dot, we use question mark dot and then open. Okay, so here is how optional chaining works. So only if the property that is before this question mark here, so only if Monday exists, then this open property will be read from there. All right, but if not, then immediately undefined will be returned. And exists here actually means the nullish concept that we already talked before. So a property exists if it's not null and not undefined. Okay, so if it's 0 or the empty string, then it still exists, of course. So if we try this now, then we get undefined. So that's exactly what I was saying. And let's just, again, recreate it here without the optional chaining, just to see the error again. And so here we would indeed get the error. Again, because all of this here is undefined, and then we read open here from undefined, which doesn't work. But here, this next operation of trying to read open only happens if all of this here actually exists. So if it's not null and not undefined. But if it is undefined or null, then the result will be undefined immediately. So let's take this out again. And so that is why we get undefined right now. And of course, we can have multiple optional chainings. So let's basically recreate what we have here. So in this example, so here we are testing for both opening hours and for Monday. So these are essentially the two optional properties that we do not know beforehand if they exist. So Monday is optional, and that's why we have the question mark here basically asking if it exists. And now we can do the same for opening hours. And now if restaurant.opening hours does not even exist, well, then the Monday property will not even be read. And so therefore we don't get that error. All right. And so this makes it really easy to prevent all kinds of bugs that sometimes we might not even expect. All right. So it also takes away all this work of doing this simply by adding this simple question mark in there. But now let's see a little bit more real world example. And for that, let me grab this weekdays array and put it here. Let's just call it days here, so it's not the same variable. And now what I want to do is to loop over this array and then log to the console whether the restaurant is open or closed on each of the days. So that's a good application of optional chaining right there. So let's start just by logging here the day, just so that you can remember how this loop works. And so indeed, now we can do some code with each of these days here. So let's now essentially do the same as we did up here. So restaurant dot opening hours, but now we cannot do this, right? Because this is not an actual property name of the object. And so remember, if we want to use a variable name as the property name, basically, we need to use the brackets notation. So we learned about this way back in the fundamentals section. And so make sure to remember that. Okay. So basically this would be the same in the first day dot Monday and then dot Tuesday and so on and so forth. But the day here is coming dynamically from this array. Okay. But optional chaining, of course, also works with that. And so now we can ask if open exists, basically. And now let's save this to a variable. And then let's log to the console. And this is not yet complete, but for now, let's see what's going to happen. So on day, and then whatever is the current day, we open at, and then here we use the open variable that we just created. Let's get rid of this console.log here. Okay. So we get on Monday, we open at undefined, undefined, undefined. And then indeed on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, we are open. And so then we get the opening hour that is actually also in the object. Let's just make sure. So this one is open 12, 11, and 0. So essentially it's open 24 hours. It opens at 12 and closes at 24. So at midnight again. All right. So that's working. But now we don't want this undefined here. Okay. And so just like before, let's set a default value. So let's use or. And so as a default, we want to say closed. So we are open at closed, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. So we could create a better sentence there, but let's leave it like this. But maybe you're noticing that now we have a problem, which is that on Saturday it says that we are closed, although actually we open, or the restaurant opens. So here on Saturday, which is this one, indeed, this property exists. So there is a property called Saturday, and so we have a problem here. And the problem is that the restaurant opens at 0. And so here we have the same problem as before, where 0 is a falsy value. And so therefore, it will then trigger this second part of the operator. But we also saw the solution to this, which is to use the nullish coalescing operator. And so that's what we do now. And now we get back to open at 0. Great. So this is an amazing use case of the optional chaining operator and the nullish coalescing operator working together. And in fact, they were introduced into the language at the same time in ES 2020 because they were really designed to work well with each other. So again, both of them rely on this new concept of nullish. And so nullish values are null and undefined. And that's it. And so that's true both for this nullish coalescing operator and also for optional chaining. Okay, great. Now that you understand how it works, let's move to the next topic, which is on methods. So optional chaining does indeed also work for calling methods. So essentially, we can check if a method actually exists before we call it. So restaurant.order, and now we can check if it exists. So we use the question mark dot, and if it does exist, then we can call it. So let's just pass 0 and 1 here. And then we should always use together the nullish coalescing operator. And so method does not exist. So let's run this. But in this case, the method does actually exist. And so here we get the expected result. When we try to call a method that doesn't exist, so let's say order risotto, and so we never wrote a method for that. And so let's see. And yeah, now we get method does not exist. And so just like before, this optional chaining operator will check if order risotto actually exists. And if it doesn't, well, then it will immediately return undefined. And so all of this then returns undefined. And so here in the nullish coalescing operator, we immediately go to that second operand. So that's this one here. And yeah, then that's the result of this whole operation. So of course, if we hadn't this, then we were trying to attempt something that is not a function. So really useful on methods as well. And finally, optional chaining even works on arrays. So basically, we can use it to check if an array is empty. So let's simply create a users array in which we can put a couple of user objects. So name, Jonas, and email hello@jonas.io. And yeah, this is just for demonstration, so let's just put one object here. And now to get the name of the first element of this array, we can do this. We can write users element number 0, and only if it exists, so optional chaining, only then take its name. Okay? And otherwise, we want to log user array empty. So let's see. And indeed, we get Jonas. And so again, this optional chaining here tests if the value on the left does exist. So users 0. Okay, so if it was empty, so users, so like this, then we get user array empty. And without optional chaining, we would have to write something like this. So if users.length greater or equal 0, then console.log this here, and else console.log user array empty. All right. And so that looks like a lot more work than what we just have up there. So here we don't need to do any check. So that's a lot better. And so now in both cases, we get Jonas. So get used to this optional chaining operator, which almost always we use then together with the nullish coalescing operator, so that we can actually do something in case we don't get a result from the object or from the array that's here on the left-hand side. All right, and with that being said, I see you in the next video.